Do you have a resilient mindset? Are you able to consistently show up as your best self, both at work and at home? Do you ever wonder why you're confident in some areas of your life, and yet in other areas you have so much fear and self-doubt? Would you like to turn your life from good to awesome? This episode is brought to you by two books: Wire Your Brain for Confidence, The Science of Conquering Self-Doubt by Louisa Jewell, and as always, the book Conversations, How to Manage Your Business Relationships One Conversation at a Time by yours truly, Ivan Farber. Both books are available on Amazon and Kindle. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Conversations About Conversations. On this show, we talk with movers, shakers, and difference makers about the conversations that they lead in the world. Our guests are business leaders, authors, speakers, podcasters, psychologists, and more. We're building a community of like-minded people who appreciate the importance and significance of meaningful conversations. Today's guest is Louisa Jewell. Louisa is one of the world's leading experts on the science of well-being and human thriving. She founded the Canadian Positive Psychology Association. She's a champion for well-being. She holds a master's degree in applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania, where she studied with the field's founder, renowned psychologist, Dr. Martin Seligman. She's the host of the Awesome Project, an Audible Originals podcast series, which is awesome. She's a featured expert in several documentaries, including The Science of Happiness and Mental Health in the City, which reminds me of the show Sex and the City. Her best-selling book, Wire Your Brain for Confidence, The Science of Conquering Self-Doubt, was named one of the 100 best psychology books of all time. She appears regularly in the media as a well-being expert in places such as Forbes, Fast Company, Oprah Magazine, The Huffington Post, Psychology Today, and now Conversations About Conversations. Please help me welcome to Conversations About Conversations, Louisa Jewell. Louisa, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ivan, and I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, before we begin, I want to thank my mother, Dr. Ruth Barber, for connecting us. I know she's been a member of the Canadian Positive Psychology Association for a number of years. She's collaborated with you. She has a very high regard for you and what you're doing. And she bought me your book, which is how I first learned about you.
I just love your mom. She's spoken at our conferences before too. Just so bright and intelligent. I've learned so much from her, and she's just this beacon of light and kindness. And you just feel good being around her. So I'm so glad she did some research on a project that I did as well. So just very, very grateful to have her as a friend and have her in my life.
Louisa, I love to give my guests the opportunity to make an opening statement. And as part of your opening statement, I'd like to ask you, in your own words, what are the conversations, the predominant conversations that you're leading in the world?
Well, I have to say at the core of everything that I do is the conversation about taking control of your own mental well-being. And so many years ago, a couple of decades ago, when I was in a clinical depression, I went to see a counselor to help, and it was helpful. But I noticed that he was reframing my thoughts. He was doing something. And I would get better and then have to go back when other things happened. And finally, I said to him, I need to know what you know. And I need to have some books, maybe some book recommendations, so I can learn more about what you know. And he gave me some book recommendations. And that's when I discovered Martin Seligman's books, and that there actually is a scientific study of psychological well-being and how to stay mentally healthy. Because a lot of the conversations in psychology for decades has really been about mental illness. And even the other day I was at an event, we were talking mental health. They automatically assume we're talking about how to manage mental illness. There's really not a conversation about how do we actually stay mentally healthy. They think it's a light and fluffy conversation, but it's not. There's a lot of scientific evidence. There are a lot of tools that help people stay mentally healthy. So the conversations we're having, especially at the Canadian Positive Psychology Association, is about getting those tools in the hands of people who can use them to continue to protect their own mental health.
Let's build on that just a little bit. How is positive applied psychology different specifically from regular psychology?
Well, so what the focus is it's not about illness, which is we think, of course, we want to study what, mental illness, because we want to know how to help people who are suffering. So it's excellent that we study, mental illness. But really what was happening is nobody was studying what keeps us mentally healthy. So what keeps us resilient, what keeps us strong. And so that's really what positive psychology is, how can we be more resilient in the face of adversity? How can we engage our strengths so that we can be better at work? We can have higher performance levels. We can have higher levels of productivity. How can we actually engage with people so that we have better relationships with people? Because we know relationships is at the core of well-being. So how do we do that? How do we leverage positive emotions to improve our mood every day? How do we direct focus to be more optimistic when we need to be more optimistic? So, and what are some of the things that we do for ourselves in terms of physical activity and nutrition, et cetera, to stay mentally healthy? How does the mind body connection factor in? So, there's, so much of what we study is really just about the plus side. People think positive psychology is about being positive all the time, whether your house is burning down or your dog dies. And that's really not what positive psychology is all about. The positive in positive psychology is just saying, just because you don't have a mental illness doesn't mean you're also flourishing. So how can we explore the plus side of positive psychology in order for us to be able to flourish?
Louisa, I read Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman, and it did strike me that he was approaching it scientifically versus just by the seat of his pants, that he was really thoughtful about the language people were using and learning optimism. I was curious to ask you, what was Dr. Seligman's biggest influence as far as you and your path?
Well, I think when I read Learned Optimism, I was fascinated by the science. I was fascinated to learn about the components of optimism, for example, how pessimism feeds into depression and the role it plays in depression, the difference between dispositional optimism and situational optimism. These were the kinds of things that I didn't really think about. I just thought you're born optimistic or you're not born optimistic, right? And I didn't even know what dispositional optimism was, or what the difference was and how it had impacted well-being. And dispositional optimism is just about kind of waking up in the morning and feeling optimistic about your day, whereas situational optimism is more about any kind of given situation. Should I be optimistic or should I be? And sometimes it's better to be pessimistic in certain conditions, right? It's better for you if you're pessimistic. Like Marty always talks about this idea that you want to be on a plane with a pessimistic pilot who's going to de-ice the wings one more time, right? So when I started to learn about all these different facets and then learned that I could actually train myself how to be more optimistic, and then that training would also help me improve my own well-being and happiness and mental health, then I thought, I have to learn this. And that's when I said, I have to go and do my master's degree. I have to learn this whole science because it is so important. And then when I got back to Toronto, because this was at the University of Pennsylvania, everyone was coming to me saying, what is this? What is this positive psychology thing you have to teach me? And that's when I started to have people at my office, and it started with 5 people around my conference room table, and then it was 13 people, and then it was 40 people. And then I thought, okay, I'm just going to start an association. And I remember going for a walk with Marty one day after I had started the association. And I said, what do? What's the first thing we should do when starting this association? And he said, you should have a conference. And so we had a conference, and he was right. Conferences really mobilize people. So, Marty has always been a trusted advisor, and, I can always reach out to him to get advice. But he really has led an international charge for positive psychology to get researchers. He gets, the money, the funding to get researchers from all around the world, thousands of researchers from all around the world to study what's right about us and kind of level the playing field in terms of increasing the amount of research so that we can learn more about it. So he's had a huge impact on my life and the life of millions of people around the world.
You mentioned doing some things to train yourself. Could you give a few examples of ways that you've trained yourself?
Well, one of the things, so rumination, for example, is when something happens and then you think about it over and over and over again. And there was a scientist at Yale who took a look at depression rates for men and women, and she found that women were twice as likely as men to fall into a depression. And so she asked the question, why? Why are women twice as likely to fall into a depression? And she discovered it was rumination. That was the difference between, women being mentally healthy or women falling into a depression. So I used to be a big ruminator. I always say I won a gold medal in the rumination Olympics because I used to ruminate about everything. And it's, again, more common for women than it is for men. So I learned how to stop ruminating. And the way you do that, there's many different things. First of all, self-compassion is a big piece of it. And there are components to self-compassion that once you understand how to be more self-compassionate, it becomes a lot easier to be more compassionate to yourself. There's also reframing thoughts properly. So there's cognitive behavioral therapy that you can actually learn and you can correct, because a lot of our ruminations, a lot of our negative self-talk is really based on kind of unhealthy ways of thinking. So if you can just learn what the healthy ways of thinking are, then you can just retrain your brain to be able to think in a more healthy way. And it's not always positive all the time. It's just healthier ways of thinking. So those are a few things. And another thing that I did is I exercise. I try to exercise every day. That is so critical to our mental well-being. So, these are some of the things that I do for myself and what I've learned.
You use the term wire your brain versus train your brain, at least in the title of your book. How do you see those as different?
Well, they're not really that different, but what happens when you act a certain way is your brain changes. So you have neural pathways. And, for example, habits are you can see that they're hardwired. We have some things that are hardwired in our brains. We know that, for example, a good percentage of our happiness and our life satisfaction is dependent on our DNA. We're kind of born certain ways, right? Now, what happens when you have that wiring and when you behave certain ways, if you start to behave differently, you see a new rewiring in your brain. And what I write about in my book is I talk about a more action-oriented kind of confidence, which is known as self-efficacy. And this is Albert Bandura's work, Dr. Albert Bandura. And so if we can act differently by thinking differently, so there's cognitive ways of changing or rewiring your brain, there's emotional ways, there's physical ways that you can rewire your brain, and all of those things, that once you start acting and behaving differently, they start to become your default pattern. And then they start to become more hardwired for you and easier to follow through on. So that's why I kind of really like this idea of rewiring through action, right? Through repeated action.
One of the things I've noted about your communication and what I would say is really generous is you're very open and self-revealing and authentic. And you've taken a real stand for people to be authentic. What do you think is the most important thing about being authentic?
Well, it's one of the number one things that people come to me about after a talk or whatever is authenticity. And I think that, when you're a speaker or for your writing books, people know if you're just not telling the truth or trying to show up as something. So I think being authentic is important so that, and I think one of the number one things that authenticity does when you reveal your own stories is it gives people permission to reveal their own stories, to say, oh my gosh, this happened to her. That's happening to me. So we connect, right? We can connect better. And then when you give people permission to be human and say, I really screwed up. And it's okay if you're screwing up too, because we're all human and we're all making mistakes. We're all perfectly flawed. And so I think that connects us to others when we can be authentic and be ourselves, right? And then I don't have to show up as somebody else or try and act a certain way because I'm just showing up as me. I give people permission to just show up, right? And just be who they want to be.
I really appreciate that about you, that here you are, someone who has founded a positive psychology association, and yet you're not just, hey, I have a big smile and I'm always rah rah. You've also been very forthright about dealing with depression. In your book, I've seen talks of you on YouTube, and I looked up some stats earlier today and noted that the National Institute of Health estimates that 1 in 10 Americans will suffer from a major depressive episode during their lives, and that 26% of Americans suffer from a diagnosable mental illness in a given year. That's 1 out of 4 people. So what strategies and recommendations do you have specifically for dealing with depression?
Well, so specifically, as I mentioned earlier, the self-talk piece of it is important. But I think exercise, I mentioned that earlier, exercise is really key. People don't think there are a lot of studies that show that exercise can be a better antidepressant for people with clinical depression than even antidepressants themselves for some people. And we're talking about unipolar depression. And of course, there's many mental illnesses that positive psychology really can't address. So we're really talking about unipolar depression. And so exercise, what it does is it actually stimulates certain things in the brain that actually improves it increases the number of neurotransmitters in your brain that actually promotes this feeling of feeling good and feeling better. And it actually creates better connections between neurons. And that's what we're finding in the study of depression, that it's really this lack of connectivity between neurons. And if we can strengthen those connections between neurons, that actually will find that people are less depressed. So there's so much research to show this connection with exercise. So I really encourage people to get out every single day and exercise. If you can do it outside and then do it with a friend. And that's another thing that's really important to depression is social interactivity. We saw depression rates rise during the pandemic because people were not able to talk to friends, be with friends. And there is a difference between texting and being on Zoom and actually being live and looking somebody in the eye. Because when you look at somebody in the eye, there's something that's physiological that occurs between two people that just doesn't happen when you're on Zoom or texting. So what we think is human connection is not so much. We really need to be face to face with people. And we are hardwired for that social connectivity. And neuroscientists have done studies to show that when people feel disconnected, the parts of the brain that register pain actually light up when we have these fMRI caps on people's brains and we can see what's happening in the brain. So it really is hardwired in us, that kind of human connection. So, and again, there's another 800 things that I could talk about in terms of, how do we protect ourselves? And this is why we're trying to teach this to kids in school, because we're saying, here's some ways that you can actually prevent mental illness. I mean, if cognitive behavioral therapy can get me out of a depression, then shouldn't I know cognitive behavioral therapy so before I become depressed so that I can think differently about what's going on in my life? It's things like that. It just makes a lot of common sense.
Tell us about your Audible series called The Awesome Project. How did that come about?
What happened was I was married, was going through a divorce, and with my husband, who I absolutely adored, did not want to get divorced at all. So we stayed good friends throughout our, divorce proceedings. And then sadly, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And so when he couldn't take care of himself any longer, my daughters and I moved him back into my home and we took care of him until he passed away. Now, friends of ours who are television production people in TV production kind of saw how we embraced, with resilience and grace, how we embraced taking care of my husband, and knowing that I was a resilience expert. They went to Audible and said, "Look, we've got this story of this woman and family who's very resilient, and seeing this through with grace and patience and love and kindness and a lot of trauma that we had to go through, and we really think there's a story here." And so they actually approached Audible. Audible liked the story, and then sadly, by the time we were producing the show, Tim passed away. That's my husband's name. So he passed away, but they still wanted to do the show about how do you stay resilient? What are the pillars of well-being? How can we teach people about well-being? And that's how it came about.
I've watched a lot of your videos on your YouTube channel, and I found The Science of the Good Life. You have a lot of great information, great tips and strategies. What I want to move into is what I like to call the lightning round of the podcast, where I ask my guest to give a short, almost like Rorschach type answer or quick comment or quick tip. And I have a whole list of things. I don't have any ink blots, but I do have ideas. So the first thing for the lightning round, Burning Man.
Burning Man, a transcendent experience.
Next, Carol Dweck, Cultivating a Growth Mindset.
So stop caring so much about looking good and care more about getting good.
Confidence without action will get you nowhere.
If you just feel confident, but then don't act to move towards your dreams, then it's not going to help you live the life that you really want to live.
An exercise that I heard you talk about called Your Future Best Self.
Future best self is about envisioning everything going well in the next few years. What does that look like? And if you can see it, feel it, touch it, and write about it for 20 minutes, 3 days in a row, it changes you. It really does. And it does improve your well-being and your confidence.
I'm going to take it on. I love that idea so much. It doesn't sound easy, but it sounds totally worthwhile. Next in the lightning round, close to my family lineage, my mother, Dr. Ruth Barber, did a presentation with you and has done work with you on the well-being water cooler.
So the well-being water cooler was something I started for the pandemic. Just half an hour, I brought people together, I taught them a tool in well-being, and then they went off and had a water cooler talk about it, water cooler chat. It connected people. They were learning. They had social interactivity. They felt supported during the pandemic. And it went on for over a year and a half, I think. And it was just I think it's one of the things that sort of kept me going during the pandemic. Although I was helping others, I think it was really helping me more.
Well, they say that, right? Like the best way to help yourself often is to help others.
And it's continuing because in this hybrid environment, so I'm continuing to do well-being water coolers because organizations are saying we need this. We need this social interactivity. So it hasn't stopped.
Something I heard you say was hope increases your happiness.
You have to have this idea that you are hopeful that what you see in the future can actually take place. If you are hopeless, that is a real recipe for depression. So anything you can do to increase hope is really important for your mental health.
This one may not be completely lightning. You may need to give lightning, thunder, and some rainstorm. The
Okay.
the pillars of well-being.
So there are 6 pillars of well-being. There's 5 pillars of well-being that Marty Seligman talks about in his well-being model. And then as practitioners, we've added a 6th. So there is positivity, positive emotions. How do you direct focus towards the positive? The next one is engagement. How can you fully engage in life? What is some of the science behind optimal engagement and flow and engaging strengths? Then the most important pillar is relationships. So having good relationships, nurturing good relationships, whether they're romantic relationships or friendship or relationships with your family or coworkers, really critical to well-being. Then there's meaning and purpose. How do you make your life more meaningful? How can you understand what your purpose is in life, whether that's small or big or whatever that looks like? Really important to well-being. Then there's achievement or accomplishment. We love to be achieving. We love to be accomplishing. So what is some of the science behind higher levels of achievement? How can we achieve more with less stress and less overwhelm? And then finally, there's the vitality piece, or some people refer to it as health piece, which is how does the mind-body connection factor into well-being? Which is why I'm such an advocate for exercise, because when I read the research on how exercise affects my well-being, I thought, well, I have to be exercising every day. And a lot of people think that it's just how we think and how it affects our body, but what's happening in our body also affects how we think and feel. So those are the 6 pillars.
So the acronym to remember the 6 pillars, I believe, is PERMA-V.
PERMA-V, and others call it PERMA-H. So, and the PERMA really comes from Martin Seligman's model of well-being, and then other practitioners have sort of added the V or the H. Yeah.
I would like to make it permanent because it would be great to be permanently positive, although unrealistic, just given what we deal with as human beings. But permanent is I vote for.
Well, and we don't suggest that you're positive all the time. Sometimes it's not even appropriate to be positive. If you're trying to figure out a complex problem, pessimism might serve you better, right? Or if your dog dies, it's really not appropriate for you to be happy at that time. Maybe it's more appropriate for you to be sad. And so really what it is it's about knowing how to leverage positivity, how to work with positivity, how to work with the negativity in a way that helps you stay resilient. And that's really what it's all about permanently.
I saw a video where you talked about a strategy for dealing with procrastination.
So procrastination can be a consequence of self-doubt. Because, for example, I kept talking about writing my book and never writing the book. I kept procrastinating because it's so yummy to talk about writing your book. But then when you write the book and you put it out there, you're then opening yourself up to social evaluation. That's what the scary part is. And so then you procrastinate, not the writing of the book, but you're procrastinating this idea of social evaluation. So if you can become more comfortable and say, you know what, I know there's some people who are going to love my book, and I know there's some people who might hate my book or think it's an awful book. And I'm okay with that because I want to get the book out there so that I can, give the knowledge that I think people need to help improve their lives. And I'm not going to worry so much about the naysayers. So that's one of the strategies, care less about what other people think and just go out and do.
That comes across loud and clear. The idea that we're afraid of being judged and criticized, and mostly we're the ones who are mostly judging and criticizing ourselves. And that to me is a very inspiring conversation that you're leading among the many. As we begin to wrap up, what else, knowing what we've talked about so far, what else do you want to include in the conversation that you and I are having today?
Well, I think you just said it. And this is that we have to stop being so hard on ourselves. We really do. Because we are all perfectly flawed. We all make mistakes. And so many times I see people just beating themselves up after these little mistakes. And if you stop that, there is a way to be positively self-critical in the sense to say, okay, that did not go as planned. How would I do things differently next time? How might I approach it? What other information do I need? What other resources do I need to support me to do a better job next time? I can do that without the calling myself names, lying in bed, beating myself up with, the harsh critic. I can leave that behind. So some people think they have to be hard on themselves to be competitive and be better, but it's not true. We need to show ourselves compassion. You can look at yourself with a positive critical eye and say, hey, I can do better, and this is how I'm going to do better. And just leave the bullying and the beating up part, out of your life. It'll completely transform your life when you do.
That is another thing that I'm going to take on that I have learned from you. So thank you for that.
Well, good. Good. And
Louisa,
I know your mom lives it too, right? Your
right,
mom lives it as well. Yeah.
right. As part of your closing statement, what do you want people to do as a result of this conversation?
Well, I would love for people to learn more about the study of positive psychology. They can learn more at my website, louisajewell.com, or the Canadian Positive Psychology Association, which is cppa.ca, and just learn more about how you can take control of your own mental well-being and how you can encourage better mental health with your children, with people you interact with, people you work with. On a daily basis. So that's what I encourage people to do.
Well, before I close, I want to take a moment to talk about the sponsor of the podcast, and that is my book, Conversations. And reading from the back of the book, it says, Conversations will reshape how you interact with your clients and colleagues. Author Ivan Farber shares insights that will bring you newfound power and ease in your career and your interpersonal communications. If you have to influence others through conversations, which of course is all of us, you will benefit from the 10 important lessons in this book. You'll get a clear formula for success, practical advice, and valuable ideas that you can apply right away. Quite simply, there's no skill more important than the ability to be effective in your conversations. And I don't just mean conversations with others, Louisa, as you and I have talked about, it's the conversations that we have with ourselves that are perhaps more decisive than any other single conversations that we have. Oh, yeah. Louisa, as a thank you for being on the podcast, I'm going to send you a copy of my book. And
yay, thank you.
It's my pleasure. And I have 3 closing statements I want to make. Number 1, as she taught me, you can never overthank people. So, Mom, Dr. Ruth Barber, thank you again for connecting me with Louisa. Louisa, I am inspired by the conversations that you're leading, being positive, coping with challenges, being resilient, helping people have actual tips and tools and strategies and techniques. And of course, as you mentioned, people can find you very easily through louisajewell.com. And finally, to the person listening to my words at this moment, that's not you or I, but that's you, the person listening, I want you to know that I'm building a community of like-minded people who appreciate the importance and significance of meaningful conversations. And I invite you to join in, direct message me, email me, ivan@conversations.biz. But if this type of conversation is important to you, if it reaches you, I believe very sincerely that for those of you, and for all of us really, who want to be great, you cannot have greatness in life without having great conversations. With that, Louisa Jewell and everybody out there, thank you for being a part of this conversation about conversations.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.